So the big vision of inclusion stories is telling stories of families that are actively advocating for their son or daughter to be included in regular school, in regular classes. And they have some level of success.
Podcast Junkies, episode 318. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you're new to the show, it's the one where we speak to interesting voices in podcasting, get them to kick back their heels, talk about their shows, and whatever else is on their mind. In case you missed last episode, we had a fantastic conversation with longtime friend, my personal friend, that sounds strange, right? My longtime friend, Shelby Stanger. She's the host of Wild Ideas Worth Living, a show that I helped her launch. And so it's amazing to see her journey to accomplished author. She's on a book tour now. Her show was picked up by REI, which is an amazing story as well. So many inspiring things have happened to her, and she's been an incredible journalist, and she's an established writer, and everything you hear about her really gets you inspired to want to go out and do wild things. So please make sure you check that out. If you haven't already, it's the previous episode. This week I speak to Tim Villegas. He takes us on an enlightening and empowering journey with his Think Inclusive podcast, where he explores a world of inclusive education through captivating stories and thought-provoking conversations. His show is a platform that amplifies the voices of people with disabilities, their families, and dedicated educators committed to creating truly inclusive environments where everyone can thrive. Tim's engaging interviews and compelling narratives bring to light the transformative impact of inclusion, inspiring parents, teachers, and anyone interested in disability advocacy. You can hear about inspiring stories that engage in challenging discussions, and you'll have a deeper understanding of what it means to build a more inclusive society that celebrates diversity and empowers everyone to reach their full potential. You're going to love this one. You're going to be inspired, you're going to be informed, and you're going to be awakened to his amazing energy. Tim is very smart and resourceful and excited to share this episode with you. If you're enjoying this episode, after, of course, you listen to it, if you haven't listened to it already, or a past episode, please leave a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/podcast junkies. Nothing makes me happier than to read this out on future episodes. Quick plug for Podcasting 2.0 apps. I'm really following the progress that they're making and excited about this ability to contribute to your favorite podcast hosts. So check out newpodcastapps.com if you're in the mood to try out some bleeding edge podcast apps like Fountain, which allows you to get direct support from your own podcast listeners. Stay tuned to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. Okay, before I jump into this conversation with Tim, here's a few words from the folks that support this show. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite, and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. So Tim Villegas, Director of Communications at the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education, and the host of Think Inclusive, and the co-host of the Trailer Park Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
It is my pleasure, Harry. Thanks for having me.
I wasn't sure if I'd get those all out.
You did great.
Rehearsing a couple of minutes before we went live. So much to cover there, and thanks for reaching out via email. Looks like you got connected with Ariel, so maybe let's start there. Ariel is obviously a friend of the show. And for those that are just listening at home or using Squadcast, she's the community manager at Squadcast. I'm the founding advisor for Squadcast, so we're big fans. And I'm just wondering how you two got connected.
So we connected like most people connect with Ariel over Twitter.
Okay.
And I probably was just kind of stalking her Twitter account, like many of us do. And she has great ideas and is always prompting the community to think and to expand their podcasting knowledge. And so I'll have to try to find the original tweet, but basically she was like, what if there was a podcast that just featured trailers? And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. We could call it the Trailer Park. And she's like, I love that name. And so a few people responded in the thread, and I think I DM'd her and I was like, hey, listen, I'm down for trying something new. what do you think? What do you need? And I could put together like a submission form that could be like a first step. And so I just basically copied the submission form that I
Thanks
used
again to Tim
for
for coming
Think
on the show.
Inclusive
Always
over it
appreciated
and
when
made
people
it
spend, when people,
appropriate
not
for what
people,
we were doing.
guests, my special
And
guests,
then
my
it just
wonderful
kind of
guests,
took off
spend
from
an hour of
there.
their
It was
time with me and
more,
share their
it was a
story with
slow
you. They're
burn.
truly
So
inspiring stories.
I
I'm
think
truly
this
appreciative of their
idea came
time.
together probably in the fall of
Full show
last
notes are
year
always available at
sometime, maybe even the
podcastjunkies.com. Intro
summer.
and outro
And
music
then
composed by
it
Cedar and
wasn't
Soil.
until
cedarsoil.com for its full
I
list of
think
music.
January or
Don't you check?
February when we really
Don't forget to check
started
out our
rolling
sponsor,
with it.
Focusrite,
And it
and their
came
awesome
together
line
pretty
of gear,
fast after
specifically
that.
their new
I think anyone
Vocaster
who's been
line, which I
podcasting
love
for any
using.
period of time
Check out the full
realizes
lineup
there's
at
no shortage of
podcastjunkies.com
ideas that would make for good
/Vocaster.
shows. There's probably
Podcast
another
production
show
marketing
that will
provided by
be
Focast. Learn more
the
at
graveyard of
focast.co to see
uncreated
if the
podcast
brand
ideas or something to that effect.
to see if a podcast
Because I
is
know
right
that
for
even
you
since I
and
started
your
this
business.
show in 2014,
Tune in
you
next
just always
week
randomly pop up with
for
an
my
idea.
conversation
And obviously,
with
I know that
Ann
Aaron said
Klassen.
about soliciting ideas or talking
And if
about
you've made it
ideas.
this far, you're no
it
doubt
seems
looking
like
for this
there's no
week's
shortage
retention
of creativity
hashtag.
in podcasting when it comes to Ariel.
Let's
so,
go with hashtag
I think we even talked about a couple ideas at
inclusive
some point.
Tim.
So it's great to see
And
that
be
some
sure
of
to
them
tag us at
actually have legs and that you've
podcast_junkies
been
if you're listening
able
all
to
the way
get
to
that up
the
and
end.
running. But let's go back to your original
Thanks for all you do to
podcast
support
journey,
the
because
show.
this is
Talk to you next
obviously
week.
not your show. So talk about the origins of Think Inclusive.
Sure. So I started Think Inclusive in 2012. I started, on my dining room with my MacBook Pro and a Logitech headset and a Skype account. And I had always wanted to podcast. In fact, I took classes in college. I'm not going to overstate myself on audio production because I was like a radio wannabe. I started really learning about sound and audio production because I was like a musician in bands. And so, late high school, early college, I learned how to work DAWs and, Pro Tools was the main thing that I learned. And I just loved it. And when I heard that there was a thing called podcasting, I had always like, I need to do this. I need to figure out a way that I can do something like this. And I'm sure, any podcaster, who ever listened to This American Life, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, it was so influential in what I thought podcasting should sound like and what it could do as far as like changing your mind and moving you emotionally. And so I started to write and blog around that time in 2012. And I'll back up just a little bit. My professional experience really is as a teacher. So I started teaching in 2003 and I taught mainly students with disabilities. And so I taught in special education classrooms and in different schools. I'm originally from California, from Pasadena, and that's where I started at Pasadena Unified School District. And so when I moved to Georgia in 2008, I needed an outlet for learning about how to support people with disabilities. And I was learning a lot about inclusion and inclusive education. And for those of you who don't know or don't realize, there's kind of these two separate systems of education in public schools in America, well, and in the world, but especially here. If you have a child with a disability, especially like a significant, one that's like significantly impacting them, like autism or Down syndrome or any other intellectual disability, their educational experience is vastly different from a typically developing person. So if you have a learner that has that kind of profile, they're typically segregated in a special education class, usually not given the same kinds of curriculum or materials. And the quality of teacher, can be sometimes suspect. And so I was definitely one of those teachers. Like I went to school to become a teacher, but I actually got a job before I finished my credential because in California, there's a shortage of teachers. And so they're like, okay, well, you meet the minimum requirements. All right, here you go. And so I learned a lot on the fly on my job. And so I felt like I was doing my best and stuff. But when I moved to Georgia, I was able to connect with some people like outside consultants who really mentored me in inclusion. And so they basically helped me along my mindset and my practices on how to include my students with disabilities in regular classes and help them learn and have it being meaningful. And so once that happened, that changed my whole world. And I just needed to know more about what this inclusion thing was. So here we are coming up on 2011, presenting at a conference, and I realized there's this whole world of educators who want to do the same thing as me. And I start tweeting. I had a Tumblr account. I started blogging. I started guest blogging. I started podcasting. And I was like, wow, this is life giving. Like, this is what I want to do. When I'm not teaching, this is what I want to do. And so it was really just having all that background knowledge with audio production and then this passion for learning a new thing, this inclusion thing, and figuring out what it was. I just went and I started emailing and tweeting everyone and like, okay, will you be on my podcast? Will you be on my podcast? And so it started off pretty slow. I don't know what your experience was, Harry, but when I first started, I produced maybe one or two episodes, and then I was like, "Oh my gosh,
It's a
like
lot.
that's a lot." So it took long breaks, and it wasn't until about 2018 that I really was doing anything consistent. And then by 2020, I had been teaching for 16 years in public schools, and I decided I needed to look outside because philosophically we weren't lining up
Okay.
with where I was at, with me advocating for inclusion for learners with disabilities and my job, it just wasn't, we weren't seeing eye to eye, and I felt like I needed to look elsewhere. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to join the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education as their communications director and bring all of that with me. So I brought the blog and the podcast. And so now that is part of my job, and I'm living the dream, really, is what I'm doing.
So much to unpack there. So let's go back to your decision to become a teacher. Like, what inspired that, or what drove that?
I did not want to be a teacher, Harry. I wanted to be a counselor. I wanted to like be some sort of marriage family therapist or
Okay.
like a counselor. I went to,
Why is that?
well, we could have therapy right now. And so
Let's
that's
do
okay.
it.
Let's do it. It's funny because so I have a 17-year-old, almost a senior. She's a junior. And, we're actually looking at colleges, and she is interested in psychology. And so it's funny because both my wife and I have a background in psychology. And the joke is, it's like, you really only become like you only go into psychology because you're trying to like right the wrongs of your of your upbringing. And so like my wife and I are like, what did we do? What did we do? So that's actually a complicated question, I think, for me, and why I wanted to be a teacher, because my parents were not educators. My dad is in cybersecurity, information security. My mom actually eventually became a social worker, but at the beginning, when I grew up, she had, worked for department stores and retail and human resources and stuff like that. So I did not have any sort of model at home that was wanting to be an educator. What really piqued my interest in the first place was one of my last classes in my psychology degree. It was called the Psychology of the Exceptional Child, and I went in thinking like, oh, I'm going to learn about gifted kids. This is great. This will be super easy.
Yeah.
And I learned that there was this whole world called special education and assessment and diagnoses. And I went to private school. So in private school, there was no such thing as like special education. Looking back, there were certainly students who probably would qualify for services if they went to a public school, and I'm sure that they received something extra, but I had no idea what that was. It was not in my vocabulary. I had no sort of idea of what that looked like. And so when I went to this class, and one of my assignments was to visit a special education classroom, yeah, a local one, I went in and I visited, and it was what we would now call like a resource classroom like a math resource. So this would be for a small group of students who maybe had some learning disabilities, and one teacher who was working, on specific math strategies to help them learn about it. And at the time, I thought, oh, this is strange. Like, what is so different about what they're doing here is that they have to do it in this separate space, But I didn't really think about it until, way later. Like, it was just like an assignment that I had to do. And so then after I graduated with my psych degree, there's not a whole lot of things you can do with the psych degree. So I found a job as a behavior therapist for young children with autism.
Okay.
Again, had no experience working, with kids on the spectrum. And I found that I went to like the weekend training that they give you, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool, And then when I started working with families in their homes, because I mostly worked with like 3 and 4 and 5-year olds, so they were like pre going into school. And then I also did some in school therapy. I was like, this is really cool, and I really like it, and I think this is what I want to do. And so, and then at the time too, I was playing music. So at the time, I wanted to be, like a rock and roller.
What instrument do you play?
My main instrument is the bass guitar, but I know how to play piano and guitar. So
Okay.
I pretended to sing. So
Did you actually start up any bands?
I did. I was in a number of bands. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In high school, college, and post college.
And what were some of the names of those? Because I always think they're super creative at the time when you're starting them up.
Oh gosh. So in high school, we were called the Daily Special.
Okay.
And we were like a punk ska band.
Okay.
Because everyone was in a ska band back in the late 90s. And then in college, I was in a band called Frank Scares Me.
Okay.
We were like emo. And then post college, I was in a band called Paloma. And we actually changed our name to Roger Moon. But we were, kind of like Radiohead wannabes. So, yeah. So I played a little bit of keys, bass guitar in most of those bands. Yeah, so I was like, we were gigging and practicing, and that's what I wanted to do. Like I wanted to play music, I lived in LA, and I gave it a real good go. And then I met my wife in Silver Lake, which I found out that Harry, you used to live in Silver Lake.
Yep. And also used to live in Atlanta.
Oh, you lived in Atlanta too?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. The connections.
In Candler Park.
Candler Park. Oh yeah, that's like right in Atlanta.
Yeah, right in Atlanta. It was at the time I was working for E-Trade, and I had a job in New York, and then they had a position open up, a director position, but the only way to get that promotion was to actually go down and run that. It was the customer service reporting division, so I'd manage a team of like 8 folks, and I would travel to Alpharetta. So I was going against the reverse commute, but it was fun. Had a group of friends down there as well. So yeah, fond memories of Atlanta and the Flying Biscuit as well.
Oh, the Flying Biscuit is amazing. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I live in a suburb of Atlanta, Marietta. So I'm sure you've passed it.
I do know Marietta very well. At least you get a little bit warmer weather there than I'm currently in Minneapolis. So it's definitely a shift. But what do you like most about living there?
Well, the cost of living is probably my favorite. And it is so lush and green and beautiful. And like, despite it raining all the time, the air is really clean. So like in LA, you would roll out of bed and not be able to see the mountains. But here, I mean, there are no mountains, but at least it's just, blue sky. And also I happen to like the thunderstorms. It's just such a difference growing up in Los Angeles. If it rained, it was just like this yucky, socked in, gray rain. And
when it did, yeah.
And then, but in the South, it's the humidity and the thunderstorms and the lightning, and it can be pretty beautiful sometimes.
It's an experience, yeah, totally.
Yeah,
yeah, it's very nice, and I think it's a nice place to definitely visit, and just a reminder of how much to appreciate the the climates you're in, and there is no perfect one either. Because I know when I lived in LA, there'd be days, forget days, months with no rain. It was just, and coming from New York, it was so bizarre to just have that stretch of time with a little. It would rain for like I think like 15 minutes, and then be like, "Is that it?" Like, is
Yeah.
that? And then you have these reservoirs and like quote unquote rivers that are completely bone dry, and you're like trying to imagine like water ever running through them. So it's, I think every place has its pros and cons. So you kind of learn to make the best of where you're at.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if anyone knows the joke of the LA River, just just Google that.
Yeah. And it's so funny when you see it on a Google map and you see the blue and you're like, oh, and you look and it's just a concrete. But I think recently with some of the crazy weather stuff that's been happening, a couple of those actually filled up with water recently.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah. Well, it's like I mean, they built it for some reason, so it must have like at one point, they needed it. So,
Yeah, not just for a scene in Terminator. So.
oh yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about how you were learning all about inclusivity, learning about special needs. I mean, growing up as a child in the 80s, if you think about the special needs program, it was just like, there was a certain stigma, I guess, if you think about it, attached to those kids. And, it was almost like it was them and they were seen as like someone that had a challenging time and just needed super extra care. And I don't know that there was a lot of awareness in terms of like how to speak to their specific needs, which I think is something that you were alluding to. And so is that the idea when you started the show, to start to tell some of these stories, or what was the thoughts when you first started incorporating everything you were learning as a teacher, everything you were learning with all this, with training into the show?
Well, I was really looking for like a show that would meet me and my like what I wanted to know about people with disabilities. And so
And where's that curiosity come from? Like, why was it something that was like really something that was driving you?
I'm not sure how unique this is, but I don't have any immediate family members with disabilities. My brother-in-law is autistic, and I have a cousin who has an intellectual disability, but nobody that I don't have any brothers or sisters or, parents and also my experience in school, I didn't have that experience as well. And I always have a hard time answering this question, but I think the best answer is that when I got into schools and realized the vast difference, like the vastly different educational experience someone with a disability, especially a significant disability, has, it just felt wrong. Like, wait a minute, this is not right. Like, there should not be two different educational systems in our schools. There shouldn't be. And the only difference is where you live. Because I can tell you, because in my job, I'm very fortunate to be able to visit and speak with school districts that are inclusive, that include all learners, that don't have disability specific programs, that value and create a sense of belonging in their schools. And so the only difference between some districts in Maryland or in the state of Washington or in Oregon or, wherever these districts are is zip code. That's it. So if the family here in Georgia wants their son or daughter to be included, there's a good chance that that district won't do it because historically they just haven't done it. It's not because they can't, it's because they have chosen not to, and also not to progress, because there's a whole host of research and educational practices that say this is the best thing for students, not just for students with disabilities, but for everyone. But if they lived in Cecil County, Maryland, or if they lived in Westland, Wilsonville, Oregon, they would be included. So it's like that whole idea injustice, I think, is really what drives me. And it's driven me since the very beginning. It's only gotten stronger as I've learned more and more about how our educational system works. So that's really what gets me up in the morning, what I think about, when I go to bed.
That's incredibly inspiring. Thank you for sharing that. How did you think about organizing the show? Did you have a format in mind? Did you know it was going to be interview based? Did you have a list of folks that you wanted to speak to? Talk about those first early years.
Yeah, so I think that I did have a list of dream guests that I wanted, and I wrote it all down, and I, emailed them or I tweeted at them, and what was actually surprising to me, Harry, was how many people got back to me.
Mm.
Because I just wasn't expecting it to be as easy as it was. It was actually pretty easy to get people on the podcast. And I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe because even in 2012, podcasting was still kind of like not something everyone did, even though it felt like it. But so I think it was still novel. So I was very fortunate to be able to speak with people about that. And as far as formatting, I've listened to some early episodes, and it's just kind of a standard interview format where like I do an intro and there's some music and we do the interview, and there's I do an outro, and there you have it. The only really difference is I edit my interviews now.
Okay.
I used to just kind of hit record and whatever happened. And now I'm much more, nitpicky about trying to make things flow and hopefully try to tell a story within, and also I'm obsessed with narrative podcasts. So, and that is another thing that I'm working on right now too, is I'm in the middle of production of a narrative podcast called Inclusion Stories. It's a 5-part series where, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but so throughout the episodes of Think Inclusive, I will produce every now and again kind of more of a narrative based episode. In fact, the one that's going to be dropping on Thursday is one of those. So I'm spending a little bit more time scripting it out and editing and stuff like that.
So how many episodes are we at now?
Well, it's interesting. Somewhere between like 90 and 100 something. I think we're getting close to 100. I had a few episodes that I took out because they weren't really Think Inclusive episodes. They were like other things that I made. So I don't really count those. So I don't think we've hit 100 yet, but pretty close. I told you before, like it was like just like 2 or 3 a year, and then it was like 6, and then it was 10, and then it was 18. And so in 2020, I was doing bi-weekly, and then right as it stands now, or 3 or 4 times a month, and that first week of the month, I'm reserving for like feed drops and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're much more prolific now.
Have you kept the same trailer that you recorded when you started the show?
No. Well, I actually took down my trailer because I need to redo it, actually.
Was that because of the new show?
Partially, yeah. I did do a trailer for like season 7, I think.
Okay.
And that trailer was up for a long time, but I was like, I'm just going to pull that down. The other thing that I want to do that I haven't yet done is do an episode 0, because what I find is people are listening to like my, like first few episodes still. Like I look at my downloads, I'm like, man, like I need to like have something at the very beginning to be like, hey, this is what you're going to experience. These are the kinds of people, that you're talking. And you actually asked me this question is, what kinds of people and how I wanted to construct the episodes. But I really wanted a cross section of educators who, were doing the work of inclusion, people with disabilities, so that they can share their experience, whether they were included or not. Because in my thinking, the experts on disability are actually people with disabilities. And that's something that I learned right away, because all I had ever learned about disability were in books,
Okay.
So really centering the voices and the stories of people with disabilities. And then a lot of families. So families who were struggling or advocating for their children to be included. And so I wanted those stories as well. So those are kinds of the main people I look for guests. And that's basically still what I do, but I'm much more, the tent is a lot bigger.
Yeah. Did you make a distinction between a trailer and episode 0?
I did.
Ah, that's interesting. I've always considered them one and the same. So, how do you distinguish them?
Well, I would say a trailer or a teaser, as Ariel likes to say sometimes, is kind of like a promotional 2 to 3 minute, like produced audio like segment where maybe you're pulling in some audio clips of guests, maybe it's just you talking about what to expect, but an episode 0 in what I'm imagining it for Think Inclusive is almost like a solo episode where I just go like, hey, this is my story, this is who I am, this is why this is important to me, and if you stick with me and you listen to these episodes and you figure out, what's important to you and what you want to learn about, this is what hopefully you'll get. So that's my idea of an episode 0.
So you think of episode 0 almost like as your inaugural episode, but you wouldn't designate that in your podcast host as your trailer episode.
I would not. No.
Okay.
No. And the reason why is because when I look at my analytics, I see that people are listening to that first episode. So rather than listening to that first episode I have with my very first guest, they're listening to me.
Yeah. And then I've also heard best practices is if you do new seasons, if you just want to refresh, it is helpful to re-record the trailer because depending on the podcast app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, they prominently show or display the trailer if it's designated a trailer as your and your podcast host. So I think it is, even as I'm thinking about it, as I was leading up to this conversation and seeing what you guys were doing with TPP, I was like, I don't think I've touched my trailer for this show since recording, which is, what a lot of podcasters say as well. So it is inspiring because I do have a second show called the Vertical Farming Podcast, and I have to listen to that one as well because I do want to submit both of them to Trailer Park Podcast as well for you guys to have a listen to and give feedback on. And I'd love that.
So vertical farming. So are you familiar with vertical harvest in Wyoming?
Yes. Yeah.
So here's a connection, Harry. Jen Tennekin is a filmmaker.
Okay.
That made a film called Hearts of Glass. And Jen was on my podcast years ago as a leading up to the film premiere. And Hearts of Glass features vertical harvest in, wait, is that what it's called?
Jackson, yeah.
Jackson, yeah. And they employ people with intellectual disabilities.
I know.
Yeah.
Nona Yehia is the CEO.
Yeah.
She's been on my show already, and she's coming on in a couple of weeks for round 2.
Oh, that's fantastic.
We're friends. I've gotten to meet her in person at some of these indoor farming conferences. She's an amazing human being.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. So I still am in touch with Jen, but I've never made it out there. So maybe one day.
Well, it's so funny to talk about all these different things. That's why I've been open about all the things that I'm working on, like this other show, because you never know, like the way these paths connect and what people are working on nowadays. And so the fact that there is a connection between you and Nona and my show and someone that you've spoken to on your show, which is really fascinating. It's always fun to kind of see all the ways that the world of podcasting connects us all together, which I think is amazing.
I know, right?
How have you grown as a host over what it's been now since 2012 with your show, like all these episodes, the ups and downs of learning what works, what doesn't? Do you find you're more comfortable in your role as podcast host now?
Much more comfortable. I think that I like to script. I script almost everything.
Okay.
So not during my interviews. Usually I have a list of questions and I've always done that. But I think that it's always been helpful for me to have a list of questions. And then if we throw it out, that's fine. But I just, and most of the people that I talk to, they're not podcasters. They're, professors or parents or people with disabilities. And so they really want to be like guided on what to do. And a lot of them are nervous. So I typically am more structured in my interviews. And at the beginning, I think I was more loose. But now, especially on the front end, I try to make the guest feel as comfortable as possible. So then, because I know that will yield a really good interview. For me, I tried to be, when I would do like my production and do my intros and outros, I tried to be more like unscripted, and I hated it Like I think some people are really good at that and I'm just not. So I think towards the middle of the production process, so after a few years, I just started scripting out all my intros and outros, and now that's what I do. It's just my standard practice. But I am surprised at how many people don't.
Yeah, I think for me, what happened is the opposite because I did, like many podcasters, when you get started, there's so many moving parts. You're so nervous about everything, especially a bit intimidated with some of these guests who, when you're getting started, they're big names in the space. And so I did have my list of questions, and I've talked about this a couple of times on the show, but just, there comes a point when you have to ditch the list because you have a short time. I remember talking to John Lee Dumas of Entrepreneur on Fire. I had like 30 minutes. He's well known for having really short windows for interviews. And I was like, this is not going to work. I just got to free flow it. Because I think it was even during the afternoon, it was like a noon or something interview. And so I just realized that for me personally, I think it keeps me more engaged and it's almost more of an interaction back and forth and me reading off the vibes of the guest and just, forcing myself to be more curious, be more attentive, pay more attention. And so it's not always the easiest thing because it requires a higher energy level. And I've noticed on times when I've decided to do 2 interviews or sometimes because of the 2 shows, like 3 interviews in a day, like energy is depleted as the day goes on and as you have this interaction because you're exchanging energy with someone, right? So
Yeah.
I had a interview today and I was like, I'm just going to reschedule it because I already know. And then I went back into Savvy Cal and I was like, I got to adjust my settings. I only want 1 of these a day because I think I'm just, learning over the years that I want to be my most available for these conversations. And I think it's a sweet spot around time of the day as well, like where your energy level is at. So it's and it's not the same for everyone. That's the thing. You have to find the rhythm that makes sense for you. And I think that's a bit of what you're alluding to. What makes you feel the most comfortable as a host when you're having these conversations?
Yeah. And you just reminded me, I am trying to figure out ways to streamline my process. And so for this next season, I've actually scheduled back-to-back interviews because I have not done that before. So this is something new for me. And I'm going into it knowing that it's going to be a day. Like it's going to be a day.
Yeah.
But I think, we all have to figure out what's going to work for our schedule and our creative process and switch things up a bit. I've been doing the same kind of thing for a long time. So I'm like, I've never done this before. So we'll see.
And the beauty of it is we're the producers of the show. We're the showrunners, whatever term you want to use. We're the editors. We're the marketers. We're wearing all the hats. And I know with this show, I did everything for this show for that first year. But it was helpful because it's helped me to launch my agency, Fullcast, and where we produce shows for clients now. We're a full service agency. But I wouldn't have realized all the moving parts and that the things that people needed help with if I hadn't done it in the beginning. So it's been really helpful. But talking a bit about format and how to change up things, we talked a little bit and you touched on narrative podcasts, which I've been a fan of myself, but I've always thought about how much work goes into making them sound the way they do. And I'm curious, what this new project is about and how you think about how much more work it's going to involve to get the sound that you're going to want from these shows.
Well, it is a lot of work and I haven't done even most of the work. It's really just collected tape. So the big vision of Inclusion Stories is telling stories of families that are actively advocating for their son or daughter to be included in regular school, in regular classes.
Okay.
And they have some level of success. So, there's a family here in Athens, Georgia, that I interviewed. There's a family closer to home, where I live. And I did some recording of families in California and a few other people that I've done remote interviews with. And so the format is going to be telling their story and then contrasting it with some field recording and interviews with school districts that are already inclusive. So I created a pilot episode, which I guess not, you certainly don't have to do it, but for me, and I'm looking for funding, it made sense for me to make a pilot to show like what it would kind of sound like to show potential sponsors. And so, and I also presented the pilot at a few conferences. So the pilot features the family story, and then I cut to this school district in Maryland, Cecil County Public Schools, where I am interviewing some school leaders, and they're explaining their process of how they include everyone. And so we have, tape of me in classrooms and talking about how preschool works. And then we go back to talking about the family and their worries about, is this inclusion thing going to last? Because, every year there's something called an individualized education program meeting. And every year the school team has to review it. And so is this going to be the year that the district is like, no, this is not going to work. Like, no, you can't do this anymore. And that's a constant fear of families. So yeah, what I do is I intermix, my narrative with clips and then some music and music beds and stuff like that. And then, I go back and forth. And it's just a lot of trial and error. No one, like, I didn't go to school for this. Haven't taken any classes. I've talked to a lot of people and listened to a lot of narrative podcasts, and I tried to make it sound the way that I would want to make it sound, but it's a huge learning curve. And I'm grateful for my employers that they took a chance on me and was like, yes, if you want to do it, do it. So I'm like, okay, we're doing this, and so I have hours of tape, hours of tape, Harry. And I'm like, well, I'm already X amount of dollars into this thing, so it's going to happen.
What's interesting about folks that are in that space, you almost know right away when they refer to their audio as tape that they're coming at it from the other angle, because that's the NPR world and where it used to actually be recorded on tape, and they refer to the hours and hours of tape that they have. But there is something really interesting. It's a specific skill set, because I love those shows too, but I'm also a bit of a perfectionist, and I feel like it would be just a huge rabbit hole, because even just if you think about the music and then the net sound of like, you talk about the classroom, I imagine like the school bell ringing and like you hear the bustle of the kids in the hallway, and then I remember I got to interview Leah Tao of Strangers, and which was one of my favorite shows at the time. And I met her at Podcast Movement, and I was like, oh my God, her shows are like so immersive, and it's so, you feel like you're in the room with these people. And so I think I remember, this is a funny story, because I spoke to her in Podcast Movement. I was like, oh, I live in California. She's like, oh, me too. She's like, oh, I live in LA. She's like, oh yeah, me too. She's like, oh, I live in Silver Lake. She's like, I live in Silver Lake as well too. So she's like, why don't you just come over to my house and record the episode? And I was like,
that is fantastic.
Leah Tal wants me to come over to her house. And I was like, this is way too much pressure. I was like a super fan of hers, her style. And so I remember recording, I think I had the portable Zoom recorder, and I put it towards the floor as I was walking on the gravel towards her door and knocking on the door and just getting that whole feel. Obviously, it's something that I didn't repeat for a lot of other episodes, especially now that I'm doing them remotely. But it's interesting, because I always think about this idea of theater of the mind, and when it's done really well, you close your eyes and you just like feel like, oh my God, like I'm in there, and you get the ambient sound, and if you can tell if you're outside or you're inside, and even like a room echo is helpful and needed sometimes if you're trying to set context. So I applaud you for tackling that challenge, because I know it's a lot of moving parts, and it's nothing like recording one of these episodes and then just like removing a couple of ums and ahs. It's just next level stuff.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to produce that kind of audio, and so I just haven't had the time or the focus to be able to do it. And so now it's a real pleasure, and hopefully it'll turn out as good as I want it to. One thing that I am looking for, though, because I know people, listen to this podcast and they're podcasters, or they're interested in the podcasting spaces. I need help. I need help. Whether it's just someone to be like, "Hey Tim, you're doing a great job. Like, keep it up," or to listen to episodes, to read scripts, to help me with music. I just need help. So if anyone's interested, let me know.
Yes. And also, it's a reminder to leverage all the platforms that you have at your disposal. Like on my second show, we just lost our editor for the newsletter. So I had to jump in there and just kind of put stuff together and just say, hey, the first thing I did at the top of the newsletter is like, hey, we're looking for someone. And someone actually just emailed me back this morning and said, I love your show. I've listened to every single episode of the podcast and I do some copywriting. I'd be honored to like work on it. I was like, okay. Sometimes you just have to make the ask. Do it on your Twitter, do it on your LinkedIn, do it every platform that you have at your disposal. Take advantage of that. So, obviously here, if people are listening to reach out, definitely we'll make sure all your contact info is available.
Absolutely.
How are things going with the new show? As with all things Ariel related, there's always she does a great job of getting the word out. I've heard James Cridlin mention it on Pod News as well, which is fun. So
yeah, that was a little surreal. The new show's great. We just wrapped our first season with the last episode. I think it was in the middle of middle of April. And so we had 8 episodes. We have 3 bonus episodes coming up. And speaking of narrative podcasts, so one of the trailers that we featured was for Serum, which is a podcast with Grant Hill from WHYY The Pulse and local transmedia. And it's funny, we're doing the show and we're listening to trailers, and I was so enamored with the trailer of Serum that I'm like, I have to listen to this show.
Mission accomplished.
So yeah. So it's an unintended consequence, but a very positive one for me, because I listened to Serum and I was like, this was fantastic. I want to interview Grant. So for one of our bonus episodes, I interviewed Grant, and we get into the idea of, just how hard it is to produce a narrative podcast, and just the emotions and the intricacies of trying to figure out how to tell a story when you're not exactly sure where it's going to go. So that's going to come out. We have going to interview Daniel from Focusrite. It's going to be a fantastic episode. And we are also going to do a more intricate critique, a trailer by a podcast. I think they're called Digital Folklore. So those have yet to be written and produced, but they will be coming in the next few weeks.
As someone who is anxiously awaiting my opportunity to submit a couple of trailers for review, what is best practice? And music, no music, just talking, duration? What do you find works best?
Well, I think Ariel and I both really enjoyed the creative aspect of trailers. So ones that weren't just necessarily, hey, my name is Tim Villegas and I host Think Inclusive and you're going to hear. So I think there's an aspect of, we do like for you to tell us what we're going to expect. But if there's a way that you can bring in your personality and kind of show us in the tone of the trailer what you're going to get when you listen, I think that is probably the biggest thing. Like, we featured Where Did I Get Like This podcast, and it was somebody who had moved around a lot, and I believe I think he was military. I'm sorry, Sean, if you're listening to this, but his personality really came out in the trailer, and he used a lot of audio clips of his guests. And so it was like, oh, I get the idea of what this is going to be about, and I think I might check it out. And then of course Serum was more immersive trailer. And so it really sets you up. If you're a narrative podcast person, then you're like, oh, there's going to be an aspect of mystery to this. And we also featured fiction podcasts. So, Newt Shuttlecotty, Where the Stars Fell. So you had an idea of, oh, this is going to be fun. It's going to be funny. It's going to be quirky. It's going to take me to somewhere unexpected. So anytime a trailer can reveal, but not too much, what's going to happen, I think it's effective. And so we talk a lot about, is this trailer effective at setting someone up for knowing what the podcast is going to be about? And so those are the ones we picked, typically.
It sounds like I'll need to do a little bit of research into my back catalog, and I'm at 310 already, so I don't know if I'm looking forward to that. But
I know, yeah, I've actually been thinking about that too. It's like, well, who do I pick? How am I supposed to pick audio clips from? I mean, you have 300, but even 80 or 90. Like, how am I supposed to do that?
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah. Probably start with the most popular downloads and then take a look at it. And the challenge with me is that I've always trying out new tools. So I started with Libsyn, then I went to Transistor, and then I went to Simplecast, and then and now I'm on Captivate. I think I even did Megaphone for a little bit as well. But my stats are like obviously non-existent when you start moving them. At this point, I don't even really look at them too much. I just look at the engagement and the feedback from the guests. And honestly, it's a platform that I have. I call it my virtual stage. And I just love the fact that if I want to have a conversation with someone, I have a vehicle for doing that. And, these conversations light me up. So that's the focus for me and the reason why I continue to do it. It's a little sporadic with episodes. Sometimes they go out every week. Sometimes they go out once a month, depending if I have guests. But I'm always appreciative of the doors that have been opened, because had it not been for this show, I wouldn't have my agency. I wouldn't have my second show. I wouldn't have met my current partners. So many amazing opportunities that have opened up in my world. Connections made, friends made for a lifetime, which I'm really appreciative of. So as we wrap up, I have a couple of questions for you. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Well, this comes to mind. So I took a lift from Atlanta back home. I had just come back from a work trip, and my Lyft driver was like talking about Dungeons and Dragons and gaming and stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really consider myself a gamer. And then we started talking, and and uh, and so I started saying all the things that I did. So like my son plays Fortnite, and so I play Fortnite with him. We just downloaded this game called, all I can think of is Jedi Survivor, but that's not the
Okay.
one. It's Jedi something. I can't think of it right now. But and then we play D&D. We have tons of board games. We go to this thing called Dragon Con, which I think you know what that, because you've been in Atlanta. So Dragon Con's huge in September. And the guy looks at me and he's like, "You're totally a gamer." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, you were so right."
That's so funny.
Because I was like, no, I'm not a gamer. I am
Yeah.
not. So that is something I'm trying to embrace. Trying to embrace my gamerness.
Yeah, I think there's different levels of it, because I started in the Atari 2600 days, definitely dating myself. But even recently, my partner and I have a Oculus VR, which has been an interesting experience. Surprisingly enough, for the workout aspect, there's a boxing game in there called FitXR, and you put that on for 12 minutes, you are sweating and you're sore the next day. So it's, for some people that just think you're just getting immersed and losing yourself and vegging out, there are ways to use, those games to benefit yourself, and even some of the brain games as well. So I think kudos to you for accepting, embracing your gamer.
Absolutely. I'm embracing my gamerness. Yes.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Most people think I speak Spanish because my last name is Villegas. But folks, I do not speak Spanish. In fact, if you try to speak Spanish to me, I will say, lo siento, mi español muy malo. That's about all I can say.
That's funny, because I was thinking about opening with a comment in Spanish, and I was like, "Oh, Villegas, perfect." I'm just going to be like, "Hey, ¿cómo estás, amigo?" And I'm glad I did it.
Well, I probably would be like, "Está bien,
Yeah.
Harry. ¿Y tú?"
Yeah. What is your heritage?
Mexican.
Mexican.
So,
okay.
Yeah, both my parents are Mexican.
Okay.
My dad was actually born in Juarez. And so.
That's a rough city.
It's a rough city. Yeah, he immigrated when he was 10 to El Paso, and then to California.
Okay. Very cool. Well, Tim, I think we covered all the bases, really wide-ranging discussions, which are some of my favorites. And so I'm super grateful. You never know where the connections in podcasting are going to lead you. You started 2 years before I did, and we had never been on each other's radar, but obviously the great connector Ariel obviously
the connector of all people.
So I'm so happy, because it was initially to talk a little bit about what's happening with Trailer Park Podcast, but also just seeing your experience and your passion for podcasting obviously made it just common sense that I just want to have you and to talk about all things podcasting on the show. So you didn't disappoint. I'm super grateful we got connected, and I'm really happy you got to share your story here.
It was an honor, Harry. Thanks for having me.
Where's the best place for folks to learn about all the things you're working on?
I'm very easily accessible on the interwebs. So you can find me at Twitter at The Real Tim Vegas, on Instagram And you can always look up my nonprofit, which is mcie.org.
Okay, we'll be sure to have all those links in the show notes if anyone has any questions about how to connect with you. Thanks again. I really appreciate this time together.
Of course.
Thanks again to Tim for coming on the show. Always appreciated when guests, my special guests, my wonderful guests, spend an hour of their time with me and share their story with you. They're truly inspiring stories. I'm truly appreciative of their time. Full show notes are always available at podcastjunkies.com. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. cedarsoil.com for its full list of music. Don't forget to check out our sponsor Focusrite and their awesome line of gear, specifically their new Vocaster line, which I love using. Check out the full lineup at podcastjunkies.com/Vocaster. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Learn more at fullcast.co to see if the podcast is right for you and your business. Tune in next week for my conversation with Ann Klassen. And if you've made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with hashtag #InclusiveTim. And be sure to tag us at podcast_junkies if you're listening all the way to the end. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Talk to you next week.